Save my knights. How far would a father go to avenge his son's death? In 1508, a coalition of Islamic powers, Mamluks, Gujaratis, Ottomans and their allies, ambushed young Lourenço de Almeida at Chaul. They shattered his squadron, killed him in brutal combat, and his body was never found. News reached his father, Viceroy Francisco de Almeida, in Cochin. For 3 days, he locked himself away, heartbroken. But grief turned to fury. From Bombay, he sent a chilling letter to Mamluk Ayaz, governor of Diu, who had helped the killers. "I, the Viceroy, tell you, Honorable Mamluk Ayaz, captain of Diu, I'm coming with my knights to your city to drag out those who fought my men at Chaul and killed a man called my son. I'll take revenge on them and whoever helps them. If I don't find them, your city won't escape. It will pay for everything. And you, for the aid you gave at Chaul, prepare yourself, for I'm on my way." 18. Portuguese ships against more than 100 enemy vessels. One man's vengeance would birth the first global empire. This is the Battle of Diu, where Portugal conquered the Indian Ocean and confirmed the supremacy of the Portuguese navy, which remained invincible for decades. Let's dive in. The Indian Ocean was not just a sea. It was a marketplace that tied the world together. For centuries, spices from India and Southeast Asia, fine cotton and silk, precious stones and exotic goods crossed these waters, moved by monsoon winds and guarded by powerful trading states. Whoever controlled these sea lanes controlled the flow of wealth between East and West. By the late 15th century, this system was well established. Muslim merchants dominated the routes from the ports of India and the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. From there, caravans carried the goods overland to the Mediterranean, where cities like Venice handled the final leg into Europe. Venice grew rich as the middleman of this global network, while the Indian Ocean remained largely closed to Christian powers from the far west. On the edge of Europe, however, a small kingdom refused to accept that arrangement. Portugal, a narrow strip of land facing the Atlantic, had spent the 15th century pushing farther down the African coast, mapping winds and currents, and dreaming of a direct sea route to the riches of India. When Vasco da Gama finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached the Indian Ocean, it was more than a navigational triumph. It was a declaration. Europe no longer needed the old overland routes. But arriving in India was not the same as being welcomed there. When the Portuguese reached Calicut, one of the great spice ports of the Malabar coast, they expected to impress the local ruler, the Zamorin, with their gifts and their exotic European goods. Instead, their offerings were seen as cheap and unimpressive compared to the luxuries already flowing through the city. The Portuguese envoys quickly realized they were not special guests. They were just one more group of foreign traders, and not particularly important ones. That first contact left a mark. In Portuguese eyes, they had crossed the end of the world to reach India, only to be treated as minor players. In response, their strategy hardened. If respect and access would not come through negotiation and gifts, they would come through intimidation and fire. Over the next years, Portuguese fleets returned to the Indian Ocean not only with merchants and priests, but with heavily armed carracks and galleons built for war as much as for trade. The fundamental idea was simple and ruthless. Trade would be enforced at cannon point. Portuguese commanders began to attack Muslim shipping, seize or sink merchant vessels, and bombard ports that resisted their demands. They set up fortified positions on key choke points and tried to impose passes on local traders, licenses without which ships could be treated as pirates and destroyed. For Lisbon, commerce and conquest were two sides of the same coin. This aggressive new player did not go unnoticed. Along the western coast of India, the Sultanate of Gujarat watched with growing alarm as Portuguese firepower threatened its ports and its merchants. Diu, a crucial harbor in Gujarat's hands, suddenly became strategically vital, not just for regional trade, but as a shield against these violent newcomers from the Atlantic. Far to the west, in Cairo, the Mamluk Sultanate faced an even more direct threat. For generations, the Red Sea route had carried spices north to Egypt, where duties and taxes on that trade filled the Sultan's treasury. Every Portuguese ship rounding the Cape and buying spices directly in India was, in practical terms, stealing money from the Mamluk state. That kind of loss could not be ignored, local Indian powers also began to react. The Zamorin of Calicut and other rulers along the Malabar coast saw that the Portuguese were not just another merchant community. They brought artillery, demanded monopolies, and did not hesitate to use violence to enforce their will. Raids on ports, naval ambushes, and shifting alliances turned the Arabian Sea into a battlefield as much as a trade route. Even Venice, watching from the distant Mediterranean, felt the pressure. If Portugal succeeded in establishing a permanent protected sea route around Africa, the old caravans through the Levant would wither, and Venice's profits would shrink with them. Venetian diplomacy and interests quietly aligned with Muslim states that had every reason to push the Portuguese back out of the Indian Ocean. By the first decade of the 16th century, the stage was set. On one side stood a small European kingdom with advanced ships, powerful cannons, and an uncompromising plan to turn the Indian Ocean into its private highway. On the other, a loose but formidable coalition of regional powers, Gujaratis, Mamluks, Indian rulers, and their allies, determined not to let a foreign intruder rewrite the rules of their world. All that was missing was a spark to ignite a true showdown. That spark would not be a treaty or a trade dispute, but something far more personal: the death of a young Portuguese commander named Lourenço de Almeida, and the grief of his father, Viceroy Francisco de Almeida. Once a father's pain entered the equation, the conflict in the Indian Ocean stopped being just about spice and silver, and started to be about vengeance. Lourenço de Almeida was not just any Portuguese captain in the Indian Ocean. He was the Viceroy's son, a rising star in a brutal new world. Still in his 20s, he had already commanded squadrons, fought and won off Cannanore, and pushed farther along the coasts of India and Ceylon, helping to carve out the first pieces of what Lisbon dreamed would be a maritime empire. To many in the fleet, he was the future, young, bold, and eager to prove that the next generation of Portuguese commanders could go even further than the first. Chaul, on the western coast of India, looked at first like just another port in a long list of contested harbors. It sat on a vital stretch of shoreline, a stop for merchant vessels moving between the Arabian Sea and the richer markets further south. But in 1508, Chaul became something else entirely, the place where the enemies of Portugal decided to strike back. A powerful Mamluk fleet had sailed all the way from Egypt, crossing to India to defend the spice trade that fed Cairo's treasury. Off the Indian coast, those ships joined forces with the Sultanate of Gujarat and with local commanders tied to Malik Ayaz, the influential governor of Diu. Lourenço found himself facing this coalition with a much smaller squadron. The waters near Chaul were treacherous, with sandbanks and narrow channels that limited his room to maneuver. When the combined enemy fleet closed in, he had a choice: retreat and abandon the position, or stand and fight against overwhelming odds. For a young captain shaped by a culture of honor and by a father who had built his career on daring actions, the idea of simply sailing away was unthinkable. Lourenço chose to fight. The battle that followed was desperate and chaotic. Enemy galleys and larger ships pressed in, their oars churning the water as artillery roared from both sides. Cannonballs smashed into timbers, splinters flew like knives through the air, and decks became slick with blood and seawater. As the tide shifted and the wind failed to favor him, Lourenço's squadron was gradually pinned against the coast. One of his ships grounded on a sandbank, turning into an immobile target under a storm of fire. Lourenço was gravely wounded during the fight. Sources differ on the exact details, but they agree on one haunting point. He refused to abandon his ship. Rather than attempt to escape to safety, he stayed aboard as his vessel burned, broke apart, and finally went down. When the smoke cleared and the wreckage settled beneath the waves, his body was gone. No prisoners to be ransomed, no corpse to be returned. For the Portuguese fleet, the message was clear. The Viceroy's son had died at Chaul, and the sea had swallowed any trace of him. News travels fast in a tight overseas empire. In Cochin, Francisco de Almeida received the report that his only son was dead, killed in action far from home, with no grave that a father could visit. The man who on paper was the king's representative and the supreme authority of the Estado da India suddenly felt something much more basic. the hollow, crushing silence left by a child who would never come back. Chroniclers describe him withdrawing in grief, shutting himself away from the outside world, while the fleet and the court waited for his orders. But Almeida's grief did not stay silent for long. After the first shock, pain hardened into a cold, focused rage. To him, Chaul was no longer just a tactical setback in a wider war. It was an open wound, a personal insult carved into his family line. In front of his captains and officers, he made it clear that the war in the Indian Ocean had changed. It was no longer only about securing ports or taxing spices. It was about making the men who killed his son, and those who supported them, pay. From that moment, every decision carried the shadow of Chaul. Almeida began to gather intelligence on who had taken part in the battle. Mamluk commanders from Egypt, Gujarati leaders, and above all the powerful Malik Ayaz of Diu, whose harbor and resources had played a key role in supporting the coalition. To the viceroy, names like Malik Ayaz were no longer distant political figures. They were targets. He started to speak of the coming campaign, not in the language of careful diplomacy, but in the language of a father, hunting those responsible for his son's death. When Almeida wrote to the authorities tied to Diu, the tone was unmistakable. In essence, his message was, "Hand over the men who fought at Chaul and helped kill my son, or your city and your ships will share their fate." He warned that if the killers could not be found, he would treat Diu itself as guilty and make an example of it, at sea and on land. The letter was political, but the heartbeat behind it was deeply personal. Every line carried the weight of a father who had nothing left to lose. For the coalition that had celebrated its victory at Chaul, this was an unexpected and terrifying development. They had defeated a Portuguese squadron and killed a young captain, but in doing so they had bound themselves to a man who now saw the entire war through the lens of revenge. The path from Chaul to Diu was no longer just a strategic route along the Indian coast. It was the road a grieving father would follow, with 18 Portuguese ships behind him to settle a debt written in blood. Francisco de Almeida was not supposed to be building an armada. Officially, his time as viceroy was ending. A new commander, Afonso de Albuquerque, had been sent from Portugal to take his place. On paper, Almeida should have been preparing to hand over power and sail home. But after Chaul, nothing existed on paper anymore. In his mind, his mission was not finished. His son's killers were still alive, protected by allies in ports like Diu, and that was something he could not accept. So instead of stepping down, he started gathering a storm. Along the Indian coast, Portuguese ships were scattered, some escorting convoys, others stationed in friendly harbors, others recovering from earlier battles. Almeida sent orders calling them in. One by one, heavy Norse nimble caravels and oared galleys converged under his flag. At the same time, he drew on local alliances, especially with the rulers of Cochin and their famed Nair warriors. These men, masters of close combat, would fight side by side with Portuguese soldiers on the decks when the time came to board enemy ships. Bit by bit, the viceroy turned a loose collection of vessels into a single hard fist aimed at Diu. In the end, the Portuguese force numbered just 18 ships. On any normal day, that might have sounded impressive, but when compared to what waited for them at Diu, it looked almost suicidal. Those 18, however, were not fragile coastal craft. They included 5 large Norse, ocean-going giants built to cross the Cape of Good Hope. Among them, the legendary Flor and another great ship, the Espirito Santo. There were 4 smaller naus, 4 round-hulled caravels, 2 lateen-rigged caravels better suited to coastal maneuver, 2 galleys, and a single small brigantine. It was a compact, tightly organized fleet, designed not just to survive in the open ocean, but to kill at a distance with heavy guns. Waiting at Diu was something entirely different, a floating city of enemies. The coalition fleet assembled there drew ships and men from multiple powers. There were 6 large Mamluk carracks and 6 heavy galleys from the Red Sea, reinforced by 4 big ships from Diu itself. Around them clustered some 30 lighter galleys from Diu, and beyond that, a swarm of warcraft from Calicut, dozens upon dozens of oared boats and smaller armed vessels that turned the harbor into a forest of masts and banners. Depending on which ships are counted, the coalition may have had well over 100 vessels in and around Diu, dwarfing the 18 Portuguese silhouettes approaching from the sea. On a simple tally sheet, the numbers were absurd. 18 against more than 100 should have been a quick, one-sided slaughter. But that sheet would have missed the most important detail. These fleets were not equal in design or doctrine. The Portuguese naus and caravels were high-sided, sturdy, and built to mount rows of bronze and iron guns along their flanks. They could fire broadsides, multiple cannons discharging in sequence, turning the sea in front of them into a killing zone. Their crews had spent years learning to use gunpowder at sea, aiming not just to damage enemy hulls, but to break masts, shred rigging, and turn decks into charnel houses before any boarding action even began. By contrast, many of the coalition's ships were optimized for a different kind of war. Mamluk and Gujarati galleys were deadly in coastal and Mediterranean-style combat, where the primary tactic was to close quickly, unleash a few heavy shots from the bow, and then board with large numbers of soldiers. They were long, relatively low to the water, and dependent on human oars for speed and maneuverability. In calm seas and narrow straits, that could be an advantage. But against high-sided sailing ships bristling with cannon, those same galleys became vulnerable targets. Their low freeboard made them easier to hit, and their crowded decks turned them into perfect victims for exploding shot and showers of splinters. Almeida understood this contrast perfectly. He knew he could not match the enemy ship for ship, so he would have to break them with firepower and discipline. Portuguese gunners had trained to use different types of ammunition and trajectories, sometimes even skipping cannonballs off the surface of the sea to smash into the hulls of enemy ships at or just above the waterline. Close-range guns loaded with grape shot or case shot could turn approaching boats into floating coffins. The 18 Portuguese ships might look outnumbered, but each one was a floating fortress designed to turn numerical inferiority into a gunnery problem rather than a boarding contest. As the fleet formed up for the voyage to Diu, the emotional weight on board was palpable. Every man knew why they were sailing. Chaul was not a distant rumor. Many of the sailors and soldiers had lost friends there, and every officer understood that the enemy believed the Portuguese had finally been checked. On the quarterdeck, Almeida walked among his captains and crew, not as a distant bureaucrat but as a commander with grief carved into his face. He reminded them of the son he had lost, of the ships smashed at Chaul, and of the message sent to their enemies. Portugal might be a small kingdom, but it would not be humiliated at sea. In the quiet moments before departure, one can imagine the viceroy looking over the decks of his ships, the Flor towering above the waves, cannons run out and ready, the caravels riding lower but quick and responsive, the galleys prepared to tow or support where needed. 18 hulls, more than 1,000 Portuguese, hundreds of Indian allies, all moving toward a single point on the map. 18 against more than 100 was no longer a statistic. It was a promise that when this fleet appeared off Diu, every gun, every sail, and every man aboard would be part of one thing: Francisco de Almeida's revenge. That dawn on 3rd of February 1509, the waters off Diu looked deceptively calm. The sea inside the wide bay was almost glassy, broken only by the silhouettes of anchored ships and the low outline of the fort. During the night, Malik Ayaz had withdrawn into the safety of the city, leaving overall command of the coalition fleet to the Mamluk Admiral Amir Hussein. The enemy ships were drawn up inside the channel and close to shore, where the guns of the fort could cover them. Out at sea, 18 Portuguese hulls rode at anchor, their decks crowded with men who knew this might be the most important day of their lives. Before the battle, Almeida had gathered his captains and laid out a clear plan. He divided the fleet into functional groups, one to engage and board the big Mamluk carracks, one to harass and break the line of galleys, one to provide long-range bombardment, and his own flagship group to anchor the center and coordinate the whole action. The idea was to keep the Portuguese ships moving, never letting themselves be caught in a static line under the combined fire of the enemy fleet and the fortress. If they could draw the coalition away from the guns on land and into open water, Portuguese artillery and seamanship would have room to work. As the morning haze lifted, the two fleets slowly closed the distance. Flags were hoisted, drums rolled, and priests blessed the men on the Portuguese decks one last time. Then, at a signal from Almeida, a gun roared from one of the naus, sending the first cannonball arching toward the clustered enemy ships. That single shot broke the silence like a crack in glass. Within moments, the entire line erupted. Thunder from the Portuguese broadsides answered by the deeper, slower boom of the guns from Diu's walls and the bows of the coalition's larger ships. The Battle of Diu had begun. At first, the coalition tried to use its coastal advantage. Lighter galleys and armed boats darted forward under the umbrella of the fort's artillery, loosing arrows, musket fire, and occasional cannon shots before pulling back toward the shallows. The Portuguese answered with disciplined salvos, but Almeida refused to rush in blindly. He held his ships just outside the most dangerous zone of coastal fire, testing enemy reactions, letting his gunners feel out the range. The air filled with smoke, and the smell of powder as cannonballs splashed, screamed overhead or smashed into the sides of unlucky hulls. Then the Portuguese began to employ a deadly trick of their own. Rather than always aiming high at masts and rigging, gunners on some ships started to fire low, sending cannonballs to kiss the surface of the water at a shallow angle. Like skipping stones, the heavy iron spheres bounced and ricocheted across the waves, each impact sending up a plume before driving on toward the enemy ships. When one of those shots struck near the waterline, it punched into the hull, where wood was thinner and closer to the sea. A single well-placed hit could rip open planking below the main deck, causing flooding that no crew could contain in time. Witnesses later described how one Portuguese ship, often associated with the Espírito Santo, loosed a devastating broadside using this technique. A Mamluk vessel that had been inching forward to engage suddenly shuddered as multiple shots smashed into its lower hull. Water poured in, men scrambled on deck, and within moments the proud ship began to list, then roll, and finally vanish beneath the surface, leaving wreckage and men thrashing in its wake. The message was clear. Getting close to this enemy meant gambling the life of your ship on every exchange of fire. Meanwhile, Hussein had a plan of his own. He kept a strong reserve of galleys inside the narrow channel behind the main line, hoping to lure Portuguese ships in, then unleash a sudden counterattack from the rear or the flank. If he could trap Almeida's naus between the fortress, the heavy carracks, and a swarm of oared galleys, the Portuguese advantage in artillery might vanish in the crush of close-quarters boarding. For that to work, though, the channel had to remain open. That is precisely what Almeida intended to deny him. At a critical moment, João da Nova brought the Flor do Mar forward toward the mouth of the channel. Massive, tall-sided, and bristling with guns, the great nau moved into position like a floating wall. Dropping anchor across the entrance, she effectively sealed the passage. Now, any galley trying to surge out had to run directly under her guns. From that dominating position, the Flor do Mar became a fortress at sea, trading fire with both ships and shore batteries, but preventing the coalition from using its galleys to encircle the Portuguese. Instead of surrounding their enemy, the coalition's reserve found itself bottled up. With the channel blocked and the enemy formation disrupted by artillery, Almeida ordered the boarding groups in. Portuguese naus and caravels surged forward against selected targets, particularly the largest carracks and key flagships. Grappling hooks flew through the smoke, biting into railings and rigging. Soldiers and Nair allies poured over the sides on boarding ladders and along tensioned ropes. Decks turned into mazes of close combat. Steel on steel, shields splintering, men screaming as they slipped on blood-slick planks. Fires broke out, some deliberate, some accidental, as powder and wood met sparks. On the enemy ships, discipline started to crack. Some crews fought fiercely, desperate to hold the line. Others panicked as Portuguese gunfire raked their decks and boarding parties spilled over their sides. One by one, critical vessels were taken. Flags were shot down or trampled, officers cut down or forced to surrender. Some ships, seeing their neighbors burning or under new colors, tried to cut anchor and flee for safety, either back into the harbor or out toward the open sea. But flight was no guarantee. Portuguese guns and pursuing ships turned several attempted escapes into floating wrecks. By early afternoon, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The coalition's big ships were sunk, captured, or disabled. The swarm of smaller craft that had once filled the harbor was shattered, many boats adrift or abandoned. Portuguese casualties were real and painful, but their line still held, and their ships still floated. Smoke drifted over Diu as masts lay broken in the water, and hulls burned or slipped beneath the waves. The sea that had been crowded with more than 100 enemy vessels in the morning now belonged, without question, to 18 battered but victorious Portuguese ships. As the guns finally fell silent, the men on Almeida's decks looked out over a harbor, transformed into a graveyard of wood and flesh. For them, this was more than just a strategic victory. Every sinking ship, every captured banner was a step toward avenging Chaul. The Battle of Diu was won, but for Francisco de Almeida, the reckoning with his enemies was only just beginning. When the guns finally fell silent off Diu, the outcome was beyond doubt. The coalition fleet that had once seemed so overwhelming lay shattered, its great carracks sunk or burning, its galleys broken and scattered, its proud banners shot down or captured. For most commanders, this would have been the moment to count ships, tally prisoners, and send letters home celebrating a decisive victory. For Francisco de Almeida, it was something different. This was the moment when the war for his son truly began. In the immediate aftermath, the Portuguese moved quickly through the wreckage of the battle. Surviving enemy ships were boarded and stripped. Wounded men, Portuguese, Indian, Mamluk, Gujarati, were dragged from the decks. Among the prisoners were Mamluk soldiers and officers who had sailed from Egypt to defend the spice trade, sailors and warriors from Gujarat, and others who had thrown their weight behind the anti-Portuguese coalition. On that blood-soaked water, they were no longer distant enemies from far-off courts. To Almeida, they were the men who had stood on the same side as those who killed his son at Chaul. What followed was not the measured clemency of a cool strategist. It was the settling of a personal account. Contemporary and later accounts describe how Almeida ordered a series of brutal punishments for many of the captured Mamluks and their allies. Some were tied close to cannons when they were fired, torn apart by the blast. Others were executed by fire, hanged from the yards, drowned, or forced into deadly duels and massacres that had little to do with honor and everything to do with terror. In some cases, bodies were dismembered and pieces displayed as warnings on the approaches to Diu. The message was unmistakable. This was Chaul's bill, paid in blood. Even among seasoned warriors, the scale and intensity of this revenge left a mark. Portuguese soldiers and sailors who had seen sieges, raids, and battles watched as their viceroy pushed the violence beyond what was strictly necessary to secure victory. To them, Almeida was both inspiring and frightening, and he had done what he had promised, brought ruin to those who had dared to touch his family. But in doing so, he had turned himself into a kind of avenging storm, more relentless than the enemy they had feared. For the surviving foes, the psychological impact was even greater. Any illusions they might have had about Portugal as a distant, negotiable power vanished in the shadow of these executions. Inside Diu, Malik Ayaz understood perfectly how dangerous this moment was. He had played a double game for years, balancing between local interests and the rising Portuguese presence. He had allowed his harbor and resources to be used by the coalition against Portugal. Now, with the coalition fleet destroyed just outside his city, he faced the full weight of a victorious enemy whose leader was driven as much by grief as by strategy. If he misjudged his next move, Diu could be bombarded, sacked, and left as a warning to every coastal ruler in the Indian Ocean. So Malik Ayaz chose survival. He sent envoys to Almeida with an offer that flipped the balance completely. Instead of defiance, he offered submission. Diu would recognize the authority of the King of Portugal, return Portuguese prisoners in good condition, pay a substantial indemnity, and open its harbor to Portuguese interests. Rich gifts were brought forward, gold, jewels, fine fabrics, to signal not just fear but a willingness to become a partner in the new order the Portuguese were creating in the Indian Ocean. The man who had once helped harbor fleets against Portugal now asked to stand under its protection. For Almeida, this was both a political triumph and a deeply personal vindication. The city tied to his son's killers was not reduced to ashes, but it was brought low, forced to negotiate from a place of total weakness. He could look at Diu and know that its governor bent the knee because Portuguese guns and his determination had made any other option unthinkable. The vengeance he had promised in his letters and speeches was no longer just words. It had taken the form of shattered fleets, dead enemies, and a humbled port, paying tribute to the crown his son had served. On the larger stage, the consequences of Diu went far beyond one man's grief. The Mamluk Sultanate, already strained, never again sent a major fleet into the Indian Ocean to challenge Portuguese power. The old spice route through the Red Sea and overland to the Mediterranean began to wither, undermining the economic foundations of Egypt and the traditional role of Venice as Europe's middleman. In their place, the Cape route under Portuguese control became the main artery of east-west trade. A small Atlantic kingdom had used gunpowder and seamanship to flip the global map. Yet for all the strategic brilliance, there was a darker side that could not be ignored. Almeida had achieved everything a viceroy could want: a crushing naval victory, the submission of a key port, and the elimination of a major threat to his king's empire. He had also gone as far as a father could go in avenging a murdered son. But in doing so, he had stepped beyond the bounds that many contemporaries considered acceptable, turning Diu into a theater of fear as much as a symbol of Portuguese strength. His name would be remembered not just for winning the battle that opened the door to a global empire, but for showing how far a man might go when grief and power sail on the same ship. In the weeks and months after the Battle of Diu, the ripples of that single day spread far beyond the harbor where the ships had burned. For the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, Diu marked the end of any realistic hope of contesting the Portuguese at sea. Building and maintaining a blue water fleet capable of sailing all the way to India had strained Cairo's finances even before the battle. Losing that fleet in one decisive clash shattered both its naval capacity and its confidence in oceanic warfare. The traditional Red Sea route, which had funneled spices north for generations, began a slow but irreversible decline. Across the wider Indian Ocean, Muslim merchants and their allies felt the ground shift under their feet. For centuries, the trade networks that crossed these waters had been dominated by Islamic powers, from the Swahili coast of Africa to the ports of Arabia and India. After Diu, that Muslim lake was no longer theirs alone. A small Christian kingdom from the edge of Europe had smashed a grand coalition and now sat astride the key routes with cannon-armed ships and fortified bases. The psychological shock was enormous. If a minor Western kingdom could do this, what else might follow? For Portugal, Diu was more than a victory. It was a coronation at sea. Before 1509, the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean was bold but precarious, a series of outposts and squadrons constantly tested by local powers. After Diu, everything changed. The destruction of the coalition fleet gave Lisbon breathing room to consolidate. In the following years, Portuguese forces would capture Goa, tighten control over key choke points, and move on to dominate other strategic locations like Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf and Malacca, on the route to the Spice Islands. The vision of a maritime empire stretching from Lisbon to the Far East began to solidify into reality. Many historians point to Diu as the battle that locked the Indian Ocean into Portuguese hands for decades. With the Mamluks broken at sea and Gujarat forced into an uneasy accommodation, there was simply no other power ready to challenge the Portuguese combination of ocean-going ships, heavy artillery, and aggressive strategy. Even when local resistance flared, it did so under the shadow of what had happened at Diu. Everyone knew what Portuguese guns could do to a fleet caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. That knowledge became a weapon in itself, making diplomacy easier in some ports and resistance far more dangerous in others. But the importance of Diu went beyond Portugal's own empire. The battle delivered a lesson that other European powers would eventually learn and imitate. Diu proved that a state with a strong navy, ocean-capable ships, and advanced gunnery could bend distant trade routes to its will, even when outnumbered in local manpower. It showed that controlling the sea lanes could be more decisive than holding territory on land. In the decades and centuries that followed, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and England would all adopt variations of this model, building their own gun-armed fleets and fighting their own decisive battles to secure maritime empires. In that sense, Diu can be seen as one of the birth moments of the age of global sea power. Strategists of the time understood this connection between sea and land. Portuguese thinkers and commanders argued that fortresses and cities in Asia were only truly safe as long as Portugal commanded the surrounding waters. Lose the sea and even the strongest stone walls would eventually fall. Keep the sea, and a relatively small number of forts and garrisons could sustain an empire stretched across thousands of miles. This logic, naval supremacy first, territorial control second, would become a cornerstone of global strategy for centuries to come. And yet, for all its strategic brilliance, the story of Diu never entirely escapes its darker shades. On one level, it is an epic tale. A grieving father, a tiny kingdom, a handful of ships facing more than 100 enemy vessels, and a single day of battle that rearranges the map of the world. On another level, it is a story of terrifying brutality, of prisoners executed in horrific ways, of terror used as a deliberate instrument of policy, and of a victory built on fear as much as on courage. The same cannons that shattered the coalition fleet were also turned on helpless captives afterward. That tension is what makes the Battle of Diu feel so modern and so unsettling. It has all the ingredients of a grand cinematic saga: revenge, impossible odds, genius tactics, and a world changed overnight. But behind the drama lies a harsh reality. The age of global empires at sea was born not just from exploration and trade, but from battles like Diu, where men were willing to burn, drown, and shatter their enemies to reshape the world. In the smoke over that Indian harbor, you can see both the dawn of a new era of naval power and the long dark shadow it would cast over history. In a single morning at Diu, a personal tragedy and a global power shift collided on the same patch of ocean. So when you look at the calm surface of a map and see neat blue lines marked trade routes, remember what lies beneath them: storms, shattered ships, and stories like Diu. Was Francisco de Almeida a hero, a monster, or both? A grieving father who went too far? And how many other battles like this, hidden in the margins of history, quietly changed the world? If you want more insane medieval battles that deserve a video, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so more people hear the story of the 18 ships that conquered an ocean.